The detective had seen his share of darkness in his long career, cases that gnawed at the edges of his sleep for years, but some, like this one, burrowed deeper, lodging themselves into the very marrow of his understanding of human nature. It was a case that began under the veneer of an unremarkable family life, a father diligently heading off to work each morning, leaving his children in what he believed was the sanctuary of their home. He couldn't have known, not in his worst nightmares, that his departure was the signal for a different, horrifying reality to unfold. For his young daughter, the closing of the front door meant the opening of a chapter of abuse, orchestrated by those who shared her blood, her own brothers. The detective remembered the initial reports, the first unsettling whispers that would eventually crescendo into a full-blown investigation. Little did he or anyone on the team suspect the true extent of the betrayal hidden behind that suburban facade, nor the quiet courage that was slowly building within the victim, a courage that would ultimately bring everything to light. This case would serve as a stark reminder that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed not by strangers in the shadows, but by those closest to us, behind doors we assume are safe. The father, a man named Arthur, was a creature of habit. Each weekday morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., his old sedan would sputter to life, a familiar sound in the quiet neighborhood. He worked at a local factory, long hours, his mind often preoccupied with providing for his family of 4 children, 3 sons and 1 young daughter, Sarah. The detective recalled how interviews with neighbors painted Arthur as a hard-working, if somewhat distant figure. He'd wave goodbye, a quick, almost perfunctory gesture, and then he was gone, swallowed by the demands of his day. He believed he was leaving his children in a safe, if modest, home. The detective often wondered what Arthur thought about during his commute, blissfully unaware that his departure wasn't just the start of his workday, but the signal for a reign of terror to begin within his own walls. As the sound of Arthur's car faded, the atmosphere inside the small house would shift, a palpable change that Sarah would later describe with chilling clarity. The detective and his team learned that the 3 brothers, Mark, the eldest and the clear instigator, followed by David and young Tom, who was barely a teenager himself but already ensnared in his older brother's cruelty, operated with a disturbing synchronicity. It wasn't a spontaneous act of malice. It was a practiced, almost ritualistic torment. They knew their window of opportunity, the hours between their father's exit and their mother's return from her part-time cleaning job in the late afternoon. The detective reviewed the case files, the transcribed interviews with Sarah. She recounted how, almost immediately after the front door latched behind their father, Mark's demeanor would change. The pretense of normalcy would drop like a mask. He would gather his younger brothers, sometimes with a silent nod, other times with a whispered command. Their target was always Sarah. The detective noted the calculated nature of their cruelty. They wouldn't just inflict physical pain. They specialized in a psychological warfare designed to break her spirit. They would isolate her, their numbers an overwhelming force against a child. The abuse, as Sarah would eventually reveal in painstaking detail, was varied and systematic, a dark pact forged between siblings against their most vulnerable member. The house, meant to be a haven, became her prison, and her brothers, her jailers. The detective found it hard to reconcile the image of these boys, just kids themselves really, with the sophisticated cruelty they inflicted. It was a chilling testament to how quickly innocence could be corrupted, or perhaps how effectively a malignant influence could take root and spread within the confines of a family. The silence that shrouded Sarah's suffering was eventually broken, not by a dramatic escape or an accidental discovery by an outsider, but by an almost imperceptible crack that widened into a chasm. The detective remembered the day the case file landed on his desk. It wasn't a frantic 911 call that brought it to their attention initially, but a report from Child Protective Services, triggered by a school counselor. Sarah, it turned out, had begun to show signs. Her grades, once average, had plummeted. She'd become withdrawn, jumpy, and on one particularly cold morning, she'd arrived at school with a bruise on her arm she couldn't or wouldn't explain convincingly. The counselor, a perceptive woman named Mrs. Albright, had patiently, gently created a space where Sarah felt safe enough to let a small piece of her torment slip out. It started as a hesitant admission about being scared of her brothers. Then, over several sessions, the dam began to break. The detective recalled reading Mrs. Albright's notes, the careful documentation of a child slowly finding the words for unspeakable acts. When the CPS investigator, and later a specially trained child interviewer from their own unit, sat down with Sarah, the floodgates opened. The phrase that echoed in the initial police report, and one the detective would hear repeated, was stark. She told us everything herself. There was no coercion needed beyond the assurance of safety, no leading questions to guide her. It was as if a tremendous pressure had been released. The detective pictured young Sarah, small for her age, recounting horrors that would make a seasoned officer flinch. She detailed the routines, the threats, the specific acts, the roles each brother played. Her voice, they said, was quiet, almost a whisper at times, yet her recall was precise, devastatingly clear. This was the true arrival of the case for the detective. It moved from a troubling CPS referral to a full-blown criminal investigation. The initial interview transcripts were harrowing. The detective and his team knew that interviewing child victims was the most delicate of tasks. They had to be patient, to listen, to validate, all while gathering the evidence needed to build a case. Sarah's courage in that interview room, facing down the memories and giving them voice, was monumental. She wasn't just a victim. She was their primary witness, the one who held the key to unlocking the truth of what happened when her father left for work. Her cry for help hadn't been a scream in the night, but a steady, brave unfolding of a terrible secret, offered to those she finally trusted enough to hear it. And they, the detective and his team, had a solemn duty to act on every word. With Sarah's detailed testimony as their foundation, the detective's team moved to the next critical phase, interviewing the accused. Mark, David, and Tom were brought in for questioning, separately. The detective had anticipated denial, but the uniformity of their stories was in itself telling. It was a united front of lies, meticulously constructed, or so it seemed. Mark, the eldest, was interviewed first. He presented as a somewhat sullen teenager, but outwardly cooperative. He expressed shock and disbelief at the accusations, painting Sarah as imaginative, a teller of tall tales, perhaps even a little troubled. He suggested she was seeking attention, or maybe upset about some minor sibling squabble she had blown out of proportion. The detective noted Mark's careful choice of words, his attempts to appear reasonable, even concerned for his sister's well-being. David, the middle brother, was next. His demeanor was more nervous, his denials less polished but equally firm. He largely echoed Mark's narrative. Sarah was making things up. He fidgeted, avoided eye contact, but stuck to the script. The detective observed the subtle cracks in David's composure, a flicker of something, fear, guilt in his eyes, but he gave nothing concrete away. Then came Tom, the youngest. Interviewing him was particularly challenging given his age. He was visibly scared, tearful at times, but he too denied everything. His story was a simpler, more childlike version of his older brother's accounts, claiming they all played together, sometimes argued like all siblings, but nothing more. The detective sensed that Tom was perhaps the weakest link, burdened by a secret too heavy for his young shoulders, yet the loyalty to his brothers, or fear of them, held firm. The investigators pressed, using details from Sarah's account, but the brothers were resolute. They had their story, and they were sticking to it. The detective and his team knew that a child's testimony, no matter how compelling, often faced uphill battles in court without corroborating evidence, especially when pitted against multiple denials. The brothers' unified denial was a significant obstacle. They tried to portray Sarah as unreliable, even malicious. The detective had seen this tactic before, the abuser attempting to flip the script, to cast doubt on the victim. It was a common and often effective defense. The team also interviewed the parents. The mother, Clara, was distraught, oscillating between disbelief and a dawning horror. Arthur, the father, was initially incredulous, defensive of his sons. The idea that such darkness festered under his roof while he was away at work was almost too much for him to comprehend. His world was tilting on its axis. The detective recognized the parents' shock as genuine, but it also highlighted how completely the brothers had managed to conceal their actions. The investigation was far from over. Sarah's words were the start, but proving them against this wall of denial would require more. If you also believe that no crime goes unpunished, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any archived cases. Your support is crucial. The investigation seemed to hit a frustrating plateau. On one side, there was Sarah, whose account, though delivered with the quiet conviction of truth, was still the word of a child. On the other stood her three brothers, older, more articulate in their denials, and united in their story. The detective knew the weight of he said, she said scenarios, especially within families. The team meticulously re-examined every piece of information. They revisited Sarah's initial interviews, looking for inconsistencies, for any sign of coaching or fabrication. There were none. Her story, despite the trauma it recounted, remained remarkably consistent in its core details, even when asked in different ways by different interviewers. The detective was struck by the specificity of her memories, the order of events, things that were said, even the way the light fell in a room during a particular incident. These weren't the hallmarks of a concocted fantasy. They were the painful etchings of lived experience. The team brought in a child psychologist to review Sarah's statements and observe her demeanor during a carefully conducted follow-up interview. The psychologist's report was unequivocal. Sarah exhibited all the signs of a child who had endured significant trauma and was recounting genuine experiences. There was no indication of manipulation or confabulation. This expert opinion added significant weight to Sarah's credibility, but it wasn't the kind of hard physical evidence that could definitively break the brothers' united front. The detective and his team pored over school records again, looking for any other witnesses, any other instances where Sarah might have tried to reach out, or where the brothers' behavior might have raised red flags. There were small things, teachers noting Sarah's increasing quietness, a few instances of Mark's aggressive behavior towards other students, but nothing directly corroborating the specific abuse she described. The pressure was immense. The detective felt the familiar frustration of knowing deep in his gut that a terrible injustice had occurred, yet struggling to find the irrefutable proof that would stand up in court. Sarah's word, her unwavering testimony, was powerful. The detective often reflected on the immense burden placed on such a young child to not only endure such horrors, but then to also be the primary instrument of justice. She had to relive her trauma with strangers, hoping they would believe her, hoping they could make it stop. Her consistency, her quiet strength in the face of her brother's denials, became the bedrock of the investigation. The detective knew they couldn't let her down. They had to find something more, some chink in the armor of lies the brothers had constructed. Malice, the detective thought, often bred arrogance, and arrogance could lead to mistakes. They just had to keep looking. The turning point, when it came, wasn't a dramatic forensic discovery or a surprise witness stepping from the shadows. It was subtler, born from relentless psychological pressure and the inherent instability of a shared lie. The detective decided on a new approach. They would re-interview the brothers, but this time armed with the psychologist's findings and focusing on the inconsistencies not between Sarah's story and theirs, but inconsistencies among the brothers' own accounts. Mal sabíamos nós que a chave para o mistério estava o tempo todo debaixo de nossos narizes. They also subtly implied that one of the brothers might be considering telling the truth to lessen their own culpability. It was a calculated gamble, designed to splinter their united front. Tom, the youngest, was brought in again. The detective handling his interview was experienced in talking to juveniles, maintaining a calm, almost paternal demeanor. He didn't accuse, he expressed concern. He spoke about the seriousness of the situation, the long-term consequences, and the importance of truth. He gently pointed out minor discrepancies between Tom's previous statement and what Mark and David had said about certain days, certain routines. He didn't press hard, just planted seeds of doubt about the strength of their shared story. The detective watched Tom through the one-way glass. The boy was crumbling. The bravado, if there ever was any, was gone, replaced by a profound, childlike fear. He kept glancing towards the door, as if expecting his older brothers to appear. Then came the moment. After a long silence, Tom whispered, "Mark made us." It was barely audible, but it was the crack they had been searching for. The interviewer calmly asked him to explain, and Tom, in a torrent of tears and half-formed sentences, began to unravel the pact. He confessed his involvement, minimizing his own role as was expected, but implicating Mark as the primary instigator and David as an active participant. He described the threats Mark made to ensure their silence, the fear that had kept him quiet. The mask had slipped. With Tom's confession, albeit a partial one, the dynamic shifted. The investigators then brought David back in. They didn't immediately reveal Tom's confession. Instead, they presented him with hypothetical scenarios, implying they had new information. David, already nervous, became increasingly agitated. When they finally confronted him with the fact that Tom had started to talk, David's composure shattered. His denials became weaker, more desperate. He tried to blame Mark entirely, then admitted his own participation in some of the acts Sarah had described. He too painted Mark as the ringleader. Finally, Mark was brought in. He walked into the interrogation room with the same sullen arrogance he'd displayed before. The detective leading this interview was direct. He laid out the evidence: Sarah's consistent testimony, the psychologist's report, and now the statements from his younger brothers. Mark initially tried to bluster, to deny, to accuse his brothers of lying to save themselves. But the weight of the evidence was too much. The detective watched as the facade of control began to crack. There were no more smooth explanations, no more attempts to discredit Sarah. Cornered, his lies exposed by those he had coerced into silence, Mark's defiance slowly ebbed away, replaced by a cold, resentful acknowledgement of the truth. The united front had been decisively broken. What detail of this investigation shocked you the most? Share your opinion in the comments below. I read all of them. With the confessions secured, however reluctant or self-serving they were, the path to arrests was clear. The detective authorized the formal charges against Mark, David, and Tom. The nature of juvenile justice meant the process would be different from adult prosecutions, but the gravity of their crimes was undeniable. The arrests themselves were carried out discreetly, aiming to minimize further trauma to the family, which was already imploding under the weight of the revelations. The detective recalled the expressions on the parents' faces when they were officially informed of the charges and the impending arrests of their sons. Clara, the mother, was a wreck, torn between her maternal instincts and the horrifying truth of what her sons had done to her daughter. Arthur, the father, seemed to age years in a matter of days, the image of his hard-working, ordinary family shattered beyond repair. The guilt he felt for not knowing, for not protecting Sarah, was palpable. The detective observed the brothers as they were processed. Mark remained defiant, a veneer of teenage rebellion poorly masking the fear and anger underneath. David was subdued, tearful, seemingly overwhelmed by the consequences of his actions. Tom was simply lost, a child caught in a nightmare of his own and his brother's making. The detective knew that the legal proceedings would be lengthy and complex, involving juvenile courts, assessments, and the ongoing support for Sarah, who would likely have to testify again. The focus now shifted from investigation to prosecution, to ensuring that the confessions and Sarah's testimony translated into a just outcome. The reckoning had begun. The price of their cruelty was no longer an abstract concept, but a tangible reality of court dates, legal representation, and the very real possibility of facing significant consequences, even within the juvenile system. The detective reflected on the concept of reckoning. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability. It was about acknowledging the profound harm inflicted and, hopefully, beginning a long and difficult path towards some form of rehabilitation, especially for the younger ones. But for Mark, the instigator, the one who orchestrated the abuse with such calculated cruelty, the detective felt a sterner sense of justice was required. The community, once it learned of the case through the carefully managed release of information, was shocked. Such betrayals within a family always struck a particularly raw nerve. The case served as a grim reminder that monsters didn't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they slept in the room next door. Did you already suspect the real culprit? Tell me in the comments when your penny dropped. Years passed. The detective moved on to other cases, other horrors, other triumphs of justice. But Sarah's case, the betrayal by her own brothers, remained a particularly dark stain in his memory. He often thought about the concept of home, supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of unconditional love and safety. In this instance, it had been transformed into a torture chamber, presided over by those who should have been her protectors. The detective pondered the dynamics of that family, the subtle currents of dysfunction that must have existed, unseen or ignored, to allow such a situation to fester. Was it a lack of parental oversight? A learned cruelty? Or something inherently dark within Mark, the eldest, that he managed to impose on his younger, more impressionable siblings? These were questions that often had no easy answers. He remembered the father, Arthur, his face a mask of bewildered grief. The detective knew Arthur would carry the weight of what-ifs for the rest of his life. What if he'd seen the signs? What if he'd been home more? What if he'd known what his sons were capable of? The mother, Clara, faced her own agonizing choices, trying to support her abused daughter while dealing with the reality of her son's crimes. The detective knew that the family, as it once was irrevocably broken. The shadow of this betrayal would loom large over all their lives, a constant reminder of the innocence lost and the trust shattered. For the detective, cases like this reinforced a grim understanding of human nature, its capacity for profound cruelty, even within the closest of bonds. But it also highlighted the resilience of the human spirit, exemplified by Sarah. Her courage to speak out, to face her abusers, to reclaim her voice, was a testament to an inner strength that belied her years and her trauma. He hoped she had found healing, that she had managed to build a life free from the shadows of her past. The detective knew that justice, in the legal sense, was only one part of the equation. True healing, for victims and for families torn apart by such crimes, was a long, arduous journey. This case, he often thought, was a stark lesson in the fragility of appearances and the dark secrets that can hide behind the most ordinary of doors. It was a reminder that the deepest wounds are often inflicted by those we are supposed to trust the most. The wheels of juvenile justice turned, as they always do, with a focus on rehabilitation as much as retribution. The detective followed the outcomes. Mark, as the primary orchestrator, received the most significant sentence, time in a juvenile detention facility, followed by stringent probation. David and Tom, due to their ages and their eventual cooperation, faced lesser consequences, including mandatory counseling and community service. Sarah was placed in a safe environment, away from the remnants of her shattered family, beginning the long, arduous process of healing. The detective knew that no sentence, no court order, could ever fully erase the scars she carried. Justice, the detective often mused, is a multifaceted concept. There's the legal definition, arrests made, sentences served, and then there's the deeper, more personal sense of justice, the restoration of peace, the mending of broken trust. In cases like Sarah's, the latter always felt elusive. How could a family ever truly recover from such a profound betrayal? How could a child ever fully reclaim the innocence stolen from her by her own blood? These were the questions that lingered long after the case files were closed. The case was a stark illustration of the darkness that can fester behind closed doors, a chilling reminder that the veneer of normalcy can hide unimaginable horrors. It reinforced the detective's belief in the resilience of victims like Sarah, but also the disturbing ease with which cruelty can take root, even in the young. If stories like this make you think, share this video. Sometimes, awareness is the first form of prevention. And don't forget to leave your like. The echoes of that father leaving for work, unknowingly abandoning his daughter to a daily torment, served as a perpetual reminder of the vigilance required, not just from law enforcement, but from society as a whole, to protect the most vulnerable among us.